Thank you. So tonight is the end of our series for 2022. And we're going to pick up the series later in 2023, working our way through history. What we're doing today, as I said last week, these first few centuries of the Common Era and the last few centuries before the Common Era are crucial for us to really understand the history of our people and the nature of the religious world of the West, because it all flowed out of that 300 years or so from just at the Maccabees through the development of the Mishnah and then the beginning of the Talmud. During that period, what crystallized was both the Judaism we call Judaism today and Christianity, which crystallized. And out of the Judaism and Christianity, Islam was crystallized a few centuries later, which flowed out of that monotheism. Without the Judaism of our era that we're studying, there could be no Christianity. And without Judaism and Christianity, it would not have developed into Islam. We were the only example of monotheism in that world. There was Zoroastrianism, which was a dualism, two gods, but ours was the only example of a monotheism until the break-off and the establishment of the other great monotheistic religions. Now, what I want us to imagine historically is, from a Jewish standpoint, there was a period when biblical Judaism coalesced, and that was the wilderness, and then the settlement of the land and the establishment of the Davidic monarchy, King David. So King David is about the year 1000. He establishes Jerusalem, BCE. And the wilderness is about 1250 BCE. So during that 300-year period, roughly, we left wherever we left, whatever happened. And again, historically, it's difficult to piece it together. Religiously, we can tell you what happened. That is, we know our story. We know we were slaves in Egypt. We got out of Egypt. We wandered in the desert for 40 years. We entered the land of Canaan, which God promised us. Eventually, we conquered that land, and we established a temple in Jerusalem under Solomon. And we had established now our biblical Judaism. Those 300 years really crystallized that Judaism. And that Judaism lasted in one form or another, really until we got toward the period of the Maccabees. We still had a temple, we still were doing sacrifices, but something else had taken place. There was this other kind of movement toward what we might call a democratizing of Judaism. There was already a development of houses of meeting and studying that was beginning to change the nature of how we thought of ourselves as Jews. But we still had a temple, we still had sacrifices, and we were living in diaspora in more and more areas. We've talked about all of this. We were in Babylonia, which now was Persia. Remember, Cyrus had conquered Babylonia. We call it Babylonia, the Babylonian Talmud, but it's really Persia. It's really the Persian Empire. We were living in the Greek Empire, in Egypt, Alexandria, and in Greece, and then the Roman Empire after that, as Rome conquered that whole area. So we were living in different places. We also were living in Judea, or what we call today Israel. So during that 300-year period or so, we shaped an entire new Judaism. The Judaism that had been growing in the diaspora and was overtaking slowly the biblical Judaism of the temple, sacrifices, priests, Kohanim, Levites, Leviim, having kings. That Judaism is biblical Judaism. Our new Judaism that was emerging was a Judaism where Levites and Kohanim played very little role, where sacrifice gets replaced with prayer, right? The reason we pray the way we pray is because, according to the rabbis, of sacrifice. They are in lieu, our prayer services are in lieu of sacrifices, actual physical sacrifices. So they were reshaping and reinterpreting biblical Judaism in order to meet the needs of a very radically changed Jewish community. This radically changed Jewish community was more educated because they had established, the rabbis established that all, as we talked about, all boys would be educated, not just the elite, but all boys, whether they were poor or rich, it didn't matter. They all learned to read, write, and do basic math. Some of the women, some of the girls were also able to learn during that time, though it was not universal and it was not required. It was still controversial, but we know it was happening. And we're going to study one of those women a little tonight. So there were reshaping of this biblical Judaism. And then the Romans, because we revolted against Rome, this is the Great Revolt of 66, which led to the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, and the fall of Masada in 73 of the Common Era. That revolt had Rome decided it was time to crush us. And in crushing us, they destroyed the temple and they made Jerusalem into a ruins. By doing that, in effect, they eliminated the competition for what was becoming rabbinic Judaism. Now, I'm not saying we desired it at that time. I don't think the rabbis ever imagined that the temple needed to be put out of existence. I think they imagined there would be two kinds of Judaisms evolving. We would have I think they imagined there would be the temple and sacrifices, and they would continue. And there would be these local synagogues, houses of meeting, where study would go on. But we would still all come together when we could to, like at Passover, to offer, biblical sacrifices. And if we couldn't go, we would send our taxes to the temple to maintain it. But when the Romans destroyed it, and we couldn't rebuild it, we tried a few times in the first and second centuries. We tried to rebuild it. It wasn't possible. So the second Judaism, this new Judaism that was living now side by side, what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism, our Judaism, was what was left, right? And so the rabbis made a conscious decision to develop that new Judaism, but yet to say there will come a time when the old Judaism, biblical, will come back. And what time is that? Mashiach Zeit, right? When the Messiah comes, we will have potentially both. Potentially both, but we will certainly have biblical Judaism again. There will be a day we can rebuild the temple. They didn't want to give up the hope that people had, because Jews believed it was given by God. And so you needed to hope that God would reinstate it. And in the meantime, the rabbis reinterpreted the revelation that God had given to this new form. And it didn't take immediately. It took a long time for people to buy into this, right? For some people, they drifted away. There was a whole group that drifted to Christianity because for them, it was a form of Judaism. If you're gonna not sacrifice at the temple, if we're not gonna follow God's way, well, this is a new God's way, so I'm choosing this. It's a lot simpler. All I have to do is believe in the Son of God who died for my sins, and I have to go to a church once a week in my neighborhood. You know, it's not bad. I could do that. So there was a whole slew of Jews that moved in that direction. And there were a whole slew of Jews that became pagans. And there were Jews who just drifted away. There was no atheism in that world. We should also remember, atheism is a modern form. We don't find it until the last 3 or 4 centuries. You could call some people agnostics because they had questions. But in the ancient world, there was nobody that denied there was a God or gods. Everyone in that world believed, virtually everyone in that world believed there was some form of power beyond that we would identify as God or gods. Any questions of this intro?
Rabbi?
Yes, Marty.
But question is, because we are the diaspora, we were all over the world, basically. I find it interesting how we all began to believe the same way. In other words, forming the religion as it is and spreading it out across the world, basically. I mean, no telephones, telegraphs, any way of getting it. I was curious as to find how all this information was put into one and everybody got it. And
Right. Okay, that's part of our lesson today is how it got spread. But I can say it simply, it got spread by scholars who went from place to place. We have a lot of evidence, a lot of stories in the Talmud about rabbis that traveled between Israel, today's Israel, and Babylonia or Persia, and back the other way. We know they traveled, there was communication with Alexandria in Egypt. So we know that they were traveling and spreading this new Torah. They were teaching it, and they were setting up little institutions like yeshivas to promulgate it and teach the Torahs, the new Torah, and show, and it gradually spread. Again, we're talking about hundreds of years. If it were today, on social media, you can get 10 million likes in an instant. In those days, it took hundreds of years to get people to eventually buy into it and to build up a substantial core that adhered to this new approach. So it was all individual. It was by sending people and messages across great distances. Other questions? Yes, Ben.
I don't want to sound naive, but what was the point or the emphasis, such a heavy emphasis on sacrificing animals? There was so much more.
People too.
There was so much more to the religion. I mean, you had, rules about, menstruation. You had rules about sexual behavior. I mean, you had all kinds of ideas of how to conduct yourself. Why such a heavy burden of sacrificing animals?
Well, I can answer it a number of different ways. One way was it was the common religious approach in the ancient world, meaning all the other religions of that day in the world, in that part of the world, offered sacrifices. Now, why did they do that? Well, economically, it was a good system for the priests. No, and the Levites. How do you maintain this religious cult, this group? Who's going to pay for that? Well, the easiest way to pay for it is for people to bring their animals, their produce, because they were all farmers and cattle people and shepherds. Ask them to bring it to us and offer it to God. And if you look at what they offered to God, they offered the inedible parts. The parts that were burned up with one or two exceptions. There was a certain sacrifice that was totally consumed. But almost all of them, the meat was given to the priests and the Levites. And once they said you could give money instead of animals, then it was complete, because now you didn't even have to bring the animal. You gave the equivalent of the animal in money. But all of that built up the treasury. And if they didn't need all that meat, they sold it. I mean, the temple was a butcher shop.
It was also, I think, probably superstition, maybe hoping for things that were better. So they felt like if they gave the sacrifice, things would be good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. People would need, well, people feel, I mean, in effect, you need to give something. Why do we donate food to food banks? I mean, part of it is there's a need, but part of it is it makes us feel we're doing something, right? Makes us feel we're contributing, we're helping somebody who needs help. So, the giving of it was to also bribe God. Yeah. I mean, psychologically, I'm giving you my best lamb. God, I could use a favor. Well, I mean, bargaining with God, it was not just a modern thing, it's a natural human impulse to say, God, I could use maybe a little more rain because my crops aren't doing so well this year. This year, I'd like a little more rain. So, there are a lot of reasons why but that form worked really well for bringing economic wealth to a group that didn't farm and didn't raise cattle, but they were important in the structure of the community, right? And in fact, one of the interesting things, some of you who might have had a firstborn son may have had a ritual called Pidyon Ben, or as they used to call it, pig in a pen, which is not very nice. It's Pidyon Ben, the redemption of the son. And the reason for that ceremony is originally, if you read in the Torah, God said you have to give your firstborn son to work at the temple. Every firstborn son had to work at the temple. So in lieu of money, you were giving workers, right? But there were too many of them. And so they said, instead of that, give us 5 shekels, 5 silver shekels, and we'll let you keep your son. But you still got to give sacrifices. So there were economic changes going on in biblical days. The problem now in the post-biblical, when the temple was destroyed, well, okay, we don't have a temple. We don't have a priesthood that can function at the temple anymore. None of that is happening. So we don't have to maintain it financially, but we still have these little meeting houses. So how are we going to maintain those? Right? Well, one of the ways is you have to have teachers to teach the kids. So we have a class of people becoming teachers, and you pay them. You don't pay them well, but eventually there's going to be a shaliach tzibur to lead the worship service, someone who has a pleasant voice. Well, you might give him something. So you give him a chicken, you give him, you give him some food, you give him a cholent, you give him a challah every week. But eventually he needs to live. And eventually a rabbi arises. And how are you going to take care of the rabbi? Well, in the Mishnah, almost all the rabbis had jobs. They had professions. They were rabbis on the side. But by the Talmudic days, many of the rabbis were already earning livings as teachers and had given up work. Some of them were wealthy for other reasons. They owned land, There were vineyards. Some of them were wealthy for other reasons. They inherited various things, but we have all kinds of stories about them as the economic system was shifting. Eventually, when you needed a halachic ruling, there was a new process that was called Shelot Uchuvot, or responsa. You would send a letter to a rabbi who was a great rabbi, and you would send a little bit of money with it. And the rabbi would answer you. So this one of the ways the rabbi in a distant land would get money from you, because it's like tipping. It's sending a little gift. But remember, this was a world where it was hard to earn money. And how are you going to study if you have to work in a field all day? You're going to be exhausted when you come home. And eventually they realized there needed to be a professional group. And that became eventually rabbis, cantors, those developed over time. Questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, Bobby.
While all this was going on, this is obviously going on in, shall we say, Europe and Asia Minor or whatever. Weren't there the religions such as Buddhism and the other Asiatic religions going on?
Sure.
But they didn't seem to cross the road to each other.
No, one of the interesting things about Asia, you know this most about Japan, they tend to be very insular. China built a wall to keep people out. That's what the wall was for. It was a defense wall. Didn't work, ultimately. They were able to breach. Walls can be breached, as we know. Walls seem to be a good idea, but they're not really such a great idea. But Asian populations seem to have a fear early on from invading or other groups coming from the West. And that would mean groups, it's not Europe yet. Europe is still, just tribal. But from what eventually became Egypt, the Middle East, Greek, Roman, Alexander the Great got into India. He pushed Westernization into India. And one of the interesting things is it affected him. He actually took on some of the Indian traits. It kind of, that culture influenced him. But the West had trouble influencing the East, and the religions of the East remained kind of outside the influence of the West for quite a while. And our Western religions also did not travel well to the East. It was cultural, largely, but there might have been other reasons. I'm assuming they knew people who had those religions, but it didn't really affect the changes that were going on. Any other questions? I do want to say, Roseanne said something about children. We didn't sacrifice children, and there was no child sacrifice, as far as we know, after the early biblical period, anywhere in the world. I mean, after you get to the 5th century BCE or so, we don't know in that part of the world of child sacrifice. We know of it in South America, in Mexico. I mean, we know some was going on there, but of course there was no, as far as we know, no communication between those areas. Okay, so I gave you an essay, and I know it came late. It was supposed to come to you last week, but there was a mix-up. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it. It's a complicated essay, but the theme of the essay, and I'm going to screen share just for a minute to show it to you, is when did Judaism begin? And it's based on this book called The Origins of Judaism. Here you can see, you see the temple in flames, right? And you see the flight of the prisoners. Okay, so that's a depiction from the 19th century of how this artist Tissot saw the burning of the temple and the Jewish prisoners going into exile. But the essay itself raises the issue. When did Jews first begin to view the observance of law as a religious obligation? That's what the essay from the book discusses. So I'm going to commend that to you. I think you should read it and try and get through it and understand it, because we have a view that comes out of orthodoxy, which is that Jews were always following halacha. There is no evidence historically that that's true. All the historical evidence indicates that there were laws Jews were following, some Jews, during different periods, but there was no consistency. Just to give you a prime example, when Joshua goes into the promised land, he has all of the young boys who were born in the desert circumcised. Well, why weren't they circumcising in the desert? Well, they weren't, apparently. There are all kinds of things like that where we see laws fell out of, for whatever fashion, out of use, and then were brought back. I've told you about the bones of pigs that were found in Jewish settlements in the land that became the land of Israel. We don't know that it was Jews eating those bones, those animals. Maybe it was foreign workers. But we do know that by the time of the Maccabees, those bones disappear. So we know that at a certain point, meaning they stop eating pigs, whoever's there. So we know that kashrut eventually does get established in a more modern way, but we don't know exactly when it happened. All I'm saying is historically, the Torah doesn't come from Sinai, but religiously it comes from Sinai. That is, the belief system, we say, takes us back to the revelation that God gave. But historians say it was a developmental process. Now, I don't know if that makes it less valid, because by now we've had hundreds and thousands of years of Jews adhering to it. But it is different than the way the Orthodox teach it. However, in the religious context, saying that it comes from Sinai still makes it religiously valid, not historically. Let me give you an example of how Jews hold on to things when everybody else leaves them. Why do we read out of a Torah scroll? And why don't Christians read out of a Torah scroll? We were all, both religions, Rabbinic Judaism, Christianity, were born at the same time, first couple of hundred years, right, of the Common Era. Why do we still have a Torah scroll on as a scroll, but the Christians read out of books when they read the Bible? Because Jews love to hold on to things even when others give them up. We do. Why? I mean, when you think about it, there are a lot of things like that. There have been people that have a tradition of tracing different elements, but that's the key understanding of how Jews are. We tend to hold on to certain things and make them holy and carry them even when other peoples who used to do this, because all books in those days were scrolls, right? There were no books as we understand it. But eventually we had books, but we kept reading out of scrolls, right? And there are lots of things that we do that are like that. The dreidel is a nice example. If you look at the late Middle Ages, there are toys that children played with, which were spinning tops that had letters on the four sides. There's a name for it. I can't remember it in English. And there's actually a painting by Bosch, one of the Flemish painters, of children's games. I don't know if any of you remember seeing it. It's a pastiche of all different children of different ages playing card games and other games. If you look carefully, one of the games is with what looks like a dreidel. It's a dreidel. And they spin it. And they gambled on it. Well, no one uses it anymore. But we do. Right? We still hold on to that dreidel. It's hard to spin. There are a lot easier ways. We now create modern dreidels that are electronic. You can spin or, right? You get them in our gift shop. I've seen them. They're being sold by Sandy right now. But we still hold on to the old dreidel because we liked it and we decided we're going to keep this dreidel. I don't care that everybody else left it. So all I'm saying is there's a flow of history that we can understand both historically and we can understand it religiously. And that's what the essay tries to depict and teach. And it takes you through. So I hope that you'll look at that. Any questions about that? Okay, so now we move into the period of the Talmud. And I'm going to look at a person, a very unusual person in the Talmud, a sui generis person. She is the only female scholar that is talked about in the Talmud in a serious way. The only one. And I want to point out that biblically, we know of a lot of serious women, right? You can name lots of them, right? Stories about women in the Bible, stories in the Torah. Women play important roles. We've talked about that. Tamar, Ruth, I mean, and then going back, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah. I mean, we got lots, Deborah, we got lots of women. In the Talmud, 300 years of discussions, rabbis galore, one woman who is featured as a scholar. So let's look at her a little bit. Her name is Beruria. Okay, there she is. That's now you can see how to spell her name in English, with an H or without, it doesn't matter. Okay, let's, who would like to read the description of Beruria? You don't have to say Hanania ben Teradion. I said it. Bobby, you want to try it?
Definitely. I like to read.
I know.
Who is Beruria, daughter of the martyr, or Hanania ben Teradion, teacher in 2nd century, one of 10 teachers murdered by Romans for refusing to follow ban against teaching Torah, wife of Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest scholars of his time, frequently quoted in the Talmud, third most frequently mentioned in the Talmud, born in the 1st quarter of the 2nd century. She lived at Tiberias, northeast Israel by Sea of Galilee, one of the only women named in the Talmud.
Okay, so let's read a couple of stories about this woman and see, get her character a little. Okay, this is from the Talmud.
Pesachim, is that what, start there? Just keep
Yes,
going.
That's the tractate on Passover.
Okay. There is a fundamental problem in the Mishnah that was clarified during the course of a particular incident. Rabbi Simlai came before Rabbi Yochanan. He said to him, "Would the master teach me the book of genealogies?" The book of genealogies was a collection of Tanaitic teachings that formed a midrash on the book of Chronicles. Rabbi Yohanan said to him, "Where are you from?" He said to him, "From Lod." Rabbi Yohanan further asked, "And where is your present place of residence?" He said to him, "In the Hardeh." Rabbi Yohanan said to him, "We have a tradition that we teach these subjects neither to Lodites nor to Nahardians, and certainly not to you, who comes from Lod, and your residence is in Nahardian,
See, the Talmud has a sense of humor.
such that you have both shortcomings." Rabbi Simlau presumed Rabbi Yohanan until,
Pressured,
I'm sorry. Rabbi
Okay.
Simlau pressured Rabbi Yohanan until he agreed to teach him. Rabbi Simlai said to him, "Teach me the book of genealogy in 3 months." Rabbi Yohanan took a clod of dirt, threw it at him, and said to him, "Beruya, wife of Rabbi Meir and daughter of Rabbi Hananiah ben Teradion, was so sharp and had such a good memory that she learned 300 halachot in one day from 300 sages. And nonetheless, she did not fulfill her responsibility to properly learn the book of genealogies in 3 years because it is especially long and difficult. And you say that I should teach it to you in 3 months. After your inappropriate request, I am not inclined to teach you at all."
So what do we, it's, first of all, it's funny. And by the way, the Talmud has a lot of these kind of stories. But did you like that he threw a clod of dirt at him? That was kind of nice.
Yeah.
Sort of wish you could do that. That's like the equivalent of throwing an eraser at a kid, which they used to do to me. They can't do it anymore, I guess. But in those days, they could take a ruler to us and throw erasers at us and chalk. I experienced all three. Now, in this story, what do we learn about Beruria?
We learned she's smart. She learned a lot of stuff in a very short time.
Right, and that
Really?
she also was studying, because she was, for 3 years, she was working on this other book that's very difficult, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So you have a woman who's not only smart, but she's actually studying, and she is the daughter of one of the very famous rabbis and the wife of one of the top 3 rabbis in the Talmud. So they could have said to her, "No, women can't study," but obviously they didn't, right? It's as if they said, "There's nothing wrong with my wife, my daughter, being a great scholar." So there we have an attitude from them. It's not the universal attitude, as we'll see, as time goes on. So let's read from Brachot, this story that shows a little more of Beruria's character.
There were some lawless men living in the neighborhood of Rabbi Meir, and they used to vex him sorely. Once Rabbi Meir prayed that they should die. His wife, Beruria, exclaimed, "What thinkest thou? Is it because it is written, 'Let sinners cease out of the earth'? But has the text Hotim? It is written, 'Hataim.' Glance also at the end of the verse, and let the wicked be no more." i.e., when sins will cease, then the wicked will be no more.
So she's taking the Hebrew word, which means sinners, and says it's not written sinners, it's written sins. You want to kill the sinners, right? It's sins that we should worry about. And that's what she's teaching her husband, the great Rabbi Meir, a lesson that he needs to rethink the way he thinks about people. So now you can finish that.
Rather shouldst thou pray that they repent and they be no more wicked. Rabbi Meir offered prayer on their behalf and they repented.
So she is so educated and smart that she can interpret the text in ways that even her husband, who is considered one of the bright, they used to say about Rabbi Meir, he had 150 arguments for proving that the snake is kosher. 150 arguments. Why isn't the snake kosher? Because it's written, my bride said. It's in the Torah. You can have 1,000 arguments, but if it's in the Torah explicitly, not much you're going to do with it, right? But that's how smart he was. And yet she was able to reprimand him and say, you should pray that they change their ways, not that they die. He does, and the story says they repented. Any comments on these two before we move on? Okay, one more story about Beruria, and then we'll see where something happened. Midrash.
Midrash on Proverbs. Beruria was the learned and compassionate wife of Rabbi Meir. While Rabbi Meir was teaching on a Shabbat afternoon, both of his sons died from the plague that was affecting their city. When Rabbi Meir returned home, he asked his wife, "Where are our sons?" She handed him the cup for Havdalah, and he said the blessing. Again he asked, "Where are our sons?" She brought food for him, and he ate. When he had finished eating, Beruria said to her husband, "My teacher, I have a question. A while ago, a man came and deposited something precious in my keeping. Now he has come back to claim what he left. Shall I return it to him or not?" Meir responded, "Is not one who holds a deposit required to return it to its owner?" So she took his hand and led him to where their 2 children lay. He began to weep, crying, "My sons, my sons!" She comforted him. The Lord gave, the Lord took.
So, before we go on, what do you think of Beruria?
Wow.
It was a great way to deal with a real difficult decision. I mean, a real difficult announcement. It was a brilliant way to deal with it. You set the predicate and then you make the connection, but it's heartrending.
Right. Well, so we see her, these are just 3 stories of her, there are others, but we see her not only as smart, we see her as incredibly sensitive toward others and toward her husband, right? To try and comfort him by saying, God gave and God took them. He only lent us these boys. What we don't know why the plague took them. She has no answers, but she believes, and so she reaffirms her faith with her husband. So now something happens after the Talmud. So I want to say something about Rabbi Meir. I think I said it to you one other time. I'll say it again. Rabbi Meir wrote an entire Mishnah. And so in the Mishnah that Judah the Prince, Judah Anasi, which is our Mishnah that he compiled, whenever it has a law and it doesn't attribute it to a rabbi, it's always to Rabbi Meir that it's attributed. That's how powerful he was. And in the Talmud, as you see, he's the 3rd most mentioned rabbi. Now, I don't know how many times you've ever heard his name, but you've certainly heard names like Akiba, and you've heard names like Hillel, but he's number 3 in the entire Talmud. So he's really, really important in the development of what we call Judaism. And as all of this is developing throughout the Talmudic discussion, and the Talmud goes for till about the 5th, 6th century. Somewhere in the 5th, 6th century, the Babylonian Talmud is finished. The Palestinian Talmud is finished around the 4th, 5th century. But the Babylonian, which is the primary Talmud that we use today, is finished around the 5th, 6th century of the Common Era. But something happens, there's a shift about how women are viewed that's taking place, and it has to do with the cultural shift going on in Europe, because now Christianity has followed Rome. Rome has become Christian. It has followed Rome into Europe. Now, Bobby, we have European,
Okay.
right? When Rome is conquering the tribes in Europe, Rome is bringing Christianity in there, right? And so we're starting to see in the late Middle Age, early Middle Ages, we're seeing Christianity dominate there. And Islam in the 7th century has started to spread in the Middle East. And Jews are caught up in both religious environments. And in the Christian world, women are no longer seen as equals. That's why they can't become priests in Catholicism or in Orthodoxies, right? So women are no longer seen the same way. And that will affect the way Beruria is seen. And I'm going to give you the example. And this doesn't occur in the Talmud or the Mishnah. This is in Rashi. Okay, this is a Rashi. And so we have to get to about the year 1100 or so of the Common Era into Europe to start to see this approach toward, okay, here's Rashi. Then Rashi comes along. I'm going to do the beginning part of this. If you don't mind, Bobby, just say.
Go right ahead.
So Rashi's commenting on a story in Avodah Zarah, which is another tractate. And the context is that there's this story there that Rabbi Meir, who is Rabbi Beruria's husband, we know, has gone, it's a very complicated story, but he's gone to rescue a prostitute who is Beruria's sister. Right? Her father, Beruria's sister, and Beruria's father has been killed. And Rabbi Meir has found out that the sister is a prostitute. She was captured. She was forced to be a prostitute. He goes to try and redeem her, to pay to get her out. At the end of the story, I'm not bringing the story, it's a very complicated story, it's long and involved. At the end of the story, the text says, Rabbi Meir was forced into exile to Babylonia. He had been living all of his life in Judea, in Israel. And at the end of it says Rabbi Meir is forced into exile to Babylonia. It doesn't say Rabbi Meir and Beruria, right? It just says Rabbi Meir is forced into exile in Babylonia. So Rashi surmises the following background to the reason why Rabbi Meir was forced into exile. Now, we don't know if Rashi made it up or he received it from his teacher. Maybe it had been an oral tradition for a while, but we're already talking about the 11th century. So Beruria died somewhere in the 2nd century. So this is almost 1,000 years, 900 years later. Okay, Bobby, you want to read this terrible?
Sure. Certainly. One Beruria mocked the rabbinic dictum, women are flight, i.e. easily seductible.
Seducible, right.
Seducible. I'm sorry. Mayer said, by your life, you will end by affirming their words. He commanded one of his students to tempt her to immorality. The student urged her for many days before she agreed. Then the plot, became known to her. She strangled herself. Rabbi Meir fled because of the disgrace.
Okay, so I'm going to explain that story a little more clearly. So the question is, why did Rabbi Meir flee to Babylonia in disgrace? Rashi brings this answer. We don't know where it comes from, but it clearly wants to discredit Beruria. What it says is that Beruria was the disgrace, and he had to run away because of it, because it kind of reflected badly on him. One, he had let her study. Two, he had been her teacher as well. Three, they'd been married all this time. So he is seen in negative terms if she is a disgrace. So what was the disgrace? So there's a statement that in the rabbinic tradition says that women are easily seduced. They are what's called kalot rosh. They're lightheaded. They're frivolous. They can easily be seduced. You know, give them a chocolate bar, whatever. You give them a candy, give them diamonds. They're easily seduced. That was an opinion. It didn't mean that all the rabbis held it. It means somebody held that opinion, and she mocked that opinion. Apparently, Meir said, by you mocking that opinion, you will fall by that. Now, again, none of this is in the Talmud. This is all of this dialogue, except for the line, women are lightheaded or seducible. That's in the Talmud. But none of the story is there. So Rabbi Meir went to a student who was particularly good looking. That's important. And young. And he said, you have to seduce my wife. And he said, I can't do that. That's a sin. He said, I'm your teacher, and I'm telling you, I'm teaching you Torah. This is an important lesson for you to learn. You must seduce her. So Rabbi Meir sets this whole thing up where day after day, the young man tries to seduce. This is reflected in the Joseph story. Remember in the Joseph story? Potiphar's wife does this day after day to Joseph. Actually, if you want to read a great novel about it, Thomas Mann wrote a series of 3 novels called Joseph and His Brothers, and he has a great scene where he describes these seductions. I'm not going into that right now, but it's an old novel, but it's worth reading. Anyway, so the student works on her, and finally, he's making progress, and he believes it will happen. So Rabbi Meir hides on the roof, and the boy says, let's meet on the roof, and we can fulfill our passion. Rabbi Meir is hiding there. She comes. The boy comes to her. Rabbi Meir comes out and said, you see, I told you women are easily seducible. And she commits suicide.
But maybe he gets exiled, not because she was married to him and he allowed her to learn, but maybe he felt like he tricked her and set her up and couldn't live with the guilt of her committing suicide.
Could be, but it definitely, from Rashi's reporting it, it's taken by rabbinic sources that it's about Beruria's character. What I'm saying is this indicates—
Called entrapment.
Well, we could call it a lot of things, but they're looking at it saying women should not. That's why in Europe, women did not study for a long time. They changed their attitude about women, and even though there are women figures that we're going to look at in the next series who were influential, they were influential partly because of the families they were in, partly because of their business acumen or ability to were politically astute, but they were no longer allowed in the Jewish religious world. And there, at this point, we have the mechitza has developed. Because in the Talmud, men and women seem to be together in the Mishnah and Talmud. But by the time we get to the Middle Ages, they're separated. And there's now a mechitza, separation. So all of this is changing, but again, it doesn't reflect biblical Judaism, and it doesn't really reflect that core period of Mishnah Talmud, but it becomes cultural. It becomes cultural. I wish I could remember the name. There's a really fascinating book. I'm giving you novels, and I don't read that many novels. But, shows the Middle Ages conflict between the Sephardic world and the Ashkenazic world, and the way they treated women, the way they thought about women. But it's not coming to me right now. Anyway, that brings us to the early Middle Ages, and we will pick up there. I don't remember when the next class is, but it's there. Joni said January 26th. So we'll pick up the class and move on into the next era. Have a wonderful Hanukkah.
Thank you.
Beautiful
Thank you.
July.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
And
Happy
and
anniversary.
a happy anniversary. Enjoy,
Birthday.
enjoy.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
Happy and healthy New Year.
Yeah.
Enjoy the year.
Enjoy
Yeah.
the kids.
Thank
and
you, Rabbi.
grandchildren.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
so
much.
much.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Good night.
Good night,
Good night.
Johnny.
Good night. Good night.